where every tale unfolds like a cozy chat over a steaming cup of coffee. Today I present to you an enchanting new mystery starring the ever-observant and brilliantly astute Miss Marple, the cherished amateur sleuth crafted by Agatha Christie. Settle in and let's piece together this delightful puzzle as a team. And if you feel inclined, drop a quick comment to share where you're joining from. It's always a joy to connect with our little detective community. Now, let's dive into Miss Marple and the Strangerette. The window framed an evening that Miss Marple always found rather comforting, the kind that belonged to villages like Little Larchwood. Outside, the rain fell in a gentle, persistent hush, misting the narrow lanes and softening the glow of lamplight spilling from cottage windows. Inside Mrs. Winthrop's tidy parlor, the clock ticked steadily, the fire crackled in a reassuring rhythm, and the sharp clack of knitting needles filled the silence between two old friends. Mrs. Winthrop, a woman with a fondness for chatter, filled the afternoon as tales of minor scandals were shared, none of real consequence, of course. Who had planted roses too close to a neighbor? Who had been seen sharing a quiet word with the butcher, despite their vegetarian vows? All very ordinary. Miss Marple, comfortably settled in the corner armchair, listened with half an ear, her hands deftly working the pale blue yarn into the beginnings of a cardigan sleeve. It was a peaceful evening indeed, until her gaze drifted to the window across the lane. For a fleeting instant, Miss Marple considered the possibility that it was merely a trick of the rain, perhaps a distortion created by the water streaking the glass. Yet, there it was again, a figure, tall and motionless, standing at the window of the house across from Greystone Lodge. The figure was cloaked in a dark coat, the collar turned up against the storm. Even from a distance, Miss Marple could perceive an unsettling quality in the posture, something hesitant, almost furtive. The face, partially hidden by the rain's reflection, remained impossible to discern clearly, but the presence lingered in the air. The very presence of someone standing there, unmoving and observing, was unmistakable. Miss Marple's fingers paused in their knitting. Greystone Lodge had remained empty for quite some time, ever since Colonel Braithwaite had closed it up and departed for his sister's home. No lights had illuminated its windows for weeks, and no footsteps had traversed its gravel path. Yet, someone was there now, silent and still, watching. Miss Marple's curiosity, always quietly humming beneath her gentle exterior, stirred to life. The figure shifted, retreating into the shadows, leaving nothing but the rain, smeared glass, and Miss Marple's own reflection staring back at her, someone at Greystone Lodge. Mrs. Winthrop's laugh was quick and dismissive, the sort of laugh people offer when they'd rather not think too hard about something uncomfortable. "Oh, you've only seen old shadows playing tricks on you, dear. That house is as empty as the day it was built." Miss Marple said nothing, which was always more effective than protest. Instead, she returned to her knitting, her expression mild. Mrs. Winthrop filled the silence with reassuring nonsense, probably a sheltering from the rain or a boy taking a shortcut through the garden. It was best not to fuss. However, Miss Marple had learned long ago that people in villages rarely see what is truly there. They see what they expect, what they hope for, or what they fear, but seldom the simple truth. And the simple truth was this: someone had stood at that window, and they had stood there for a reason. Over tea, Miss Marple broached the subject again, her tone as casual as though she were inquiring about the vicar's rheumatism. "When did you say the colonel?" She inquired of her knitting needles, never faltering. It had been several weeks, hadn't it? "Oh, much longer," Mrs. Winthrop replied, relieved to find solid ground. The place had been closed up since Mluss. No one had entered or exited since then except for old Jenkins, who came to air it out once a month. No visitors, no tenants, no caretakers staying overnight. The house was intended to be vacant, yet someone had stood at that window. Miss Marple tucked this information away like a stitch carefully placed into a growing pattern. When a pattern begins to emerge, she understood that the truth was never far behind. As the evening drew to a close and the rain faded to a gentle murmur, Miss Marple's needles clicked away in a steady cadence, mirroring the tranquil flow of her thoughts. A silhouette lingered at the window of an empty house, while the village chose to overlook such peculiarities as mere flights of fancy. Yet, Miss Marple, with her wealth of experience, understood that the initial hint of something unusual, no matter how brief, often served as the loose thread that unraveled the entire tapestry. She cast another glance at Greystone Lodge, its windows dark and unremarkable, yet holding secrets within. In her mind's eye, she still perceived the shadowy figure, perfectly still in the rain, as if anticipating something or someone. The cardigan sleeve grew longer. The puzzle she understood had only just begun. By morning, the rain had lifted, leaving the village washed clean and glistening beneath a pale sky, yet the air felt anything but fresh. News had spread faster than any storm. The reclusive Colonel Braithwaite had been found dead at Greystone Lodge, and the whisper of murder was already curling through Little Larchwood like smoke. At the village shop, the conversation transitioned from discussions of butter rations and jam recipes to the unsettling events surrounding a dark affair. Was it a burglary gone awry, or something more sinister? Perhaps an old grudge finally settled in the dead of night. Mrs. Parsons, whose embroidery skills were only matched by her thirst for scandal, insisted she had always sensed something unnatural about that house. Mr. Gibbs, the postmaster, leaned in with a grave nod, reminding all who would listen that the Colonel's affairs had always been cloaked in mystery. Through it all, Miss Marple listened, her expression as serene as ever. Gossip, after all, was the village's second language, and often, if you listened closely enough, it spoke the truth without even meaning to. The police arrived just after breakfast, their presence marked by the heavy tread of boots on gravel and the clipped tones of official inquiry. Inside Greystone Lodge, the truth lay waiting, slumped in a faded armchair, hands resting limply on the armrests. Colonel Braithwaite was quite dead, a sharp blow to the back of his. The head had ended his life swift and silent sometime during the night. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, just the Colonel, his lifeless gaze fixed towards the window, as though even in death his attention lingered there. Miss Marple, standing quietly at the garden gate, absorbed it all. Without word, violence, after all, was not so rare in small villages. Only the forms changed. A careless word, a ruined reputation, or, as in this case, a quiet murder in a quiet room. The stories began almost immediately. Some said the Colonel had concealed a wealth of gold sovereigns in an undisclosed location within Greystone Lodge, a treasure harking back to his time in India. Whispers of a family curse circulated, a series of calamities that had haunted the Braithwaites for generations, each culminating in untimely demise. Miss Marple offered a faint smile at the more fanciful interpretations. The villagers had a knack for transforming even the most mundane truths into captivating legends. In her experience, the reality was typically far more commonplace and significantly more perilous. By mid-afternoon, the maid from the house next door arrived at the police station, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron, her face drained of color under the burden of a secret. She claimed to have seen someone, a shadow, slipping into Greystone Lodge well past midnight. Yet, when pressed for details, her description failed to align with the tall, cloaked figure Miss Marple had caught a glimpse of the night before. This figure, the maid insisted, was smaller, slighter, and more hesitant than menacing. Whoever it was had lingered at the door, as if caught in a moment of indecision, unsure whether to knock or to flee. Miss Marple, listening from the corner, concealed the inconsistency. Two figures, two sightings, two narratives that could not coexist. The police eagerly pursued the route laid out for them. The maid's testimony, the Colonel's questionable standing, and the reassuring belief that the truth would eventually surface. Miss Marple, however, understood more deeply. People perceived what they anticipated, especially on tempestuous nights, but the truth, the genuine truth, was seldom so accommodating. The figure she had observed had been tall and purposeful, not diminutive and hesitant. She sensed someone was lying, and the first lie, as always, was the most crucial to unravel. By dusk, Greystone Lodge stood empty once more, its windows dark, its silence profound. Yet to Miss Marple, the house felt like a living entity, a place that had witnessed too much, holding its breath in fear of what might come next. From her seat by Mrs. Winthrop's hearth, Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly, her thoughts circling the house across the lane. Somewhere between the rain and the rumors, the truth awaited. In her own unassuming manner, Miss Marple was determined to uncover the truth. She had mastered the delicate craft of posing questions without ever seeming to pry. In the quaint village of Larchwood, such talents were essential. Whether over tea at the local shop, while choosing a spool of thread at the haberdashery, or during a brief stop at the post office to ask about stamps, Miss Marple's soft-spoken inquiries effortlessly led to discussions about the late Colonel Braithwaite. It appeared that the Colonel's legacy had not softened with his departure, as disputes regarding finances lingered in the air. Softly spoken hints of a rather unfortunate event intertwined with a long-standing dispute with a local tradesman, resulting in a silence that lingered between them. Each exchange presented a unique perspective, and Miss Marple received them all with a gentle smile, cataloging each comment not for its explicit content, but for the subtleties that remained unspoken. In any village, certain individuals leave an immediate void, be it a cheerful neighbor, a benevolent vicar, a supportive shopkeeper, or Colonel Braithwaite, it appeared, wasn't one of those individuals. "Oh, I suppose someone had to say it," Mrs. Cartwright murmured, her voice low but lacking any real remorse. The Colonel wasn't exactly a beloved figure, was he? What unfolded was a depiction of a man who had been endured rather than cherished. His wealth had proven useful, his influence occasionally advantageous, yet his presence, temperament, and tendency to hold on to grievances long after they had expired had garnered him scant affection. Miss Marple listened without passing judgment. In villages, dislike is often endured until it. Wasn't it during a casual conversation with Mrs. Wilkins, whose husband had repaired fences for half the village, that the Fenton situation emerged? The Fentons, they haven't communicated with the Braithwaites in years. Mrs. Wilkins elaborated, folding laundry with precise efficiency, recounting the entire ordeal regarding the orchard boundary. And then, of course, there was the unfortunate collapse of young Evelyn's engagement to the Colonel's son. Quite the unpleasant affair, indeed. Miss Marple made a sympathetic sound, though her thoughts were already racing ahead. Feuds in villages seldom revolve around what seemed to be a boundary line, a broken engagement, were often symptoms rather than causes. What truly mattered was this: the Fentons had instilled a deep-seated animosity towards the Colonel, and that hatred for Miss Marple could lie dormant for years, only to resurface at the most inconvenient moments. It was the milkman, cheerful and unaware of the weight of his words, who provided the most surprising clue. "Odd thing, though," he remarked as Miss Marple counted out her coins. "There were lights on at Greystone Lodge last week, 2 or 3 evenings in a row. A row caught my attention during my early morning strolls, but I assumed the Colonel had a guest." Miss Marple's smile remained steady, though her fingers hesitated momentarily over her purse clasp. The house was said to be empty. No one in the village had witnessed anyone arriving or departing. Yet, if the milkman was to be trusted, and she knew that milkmen seldom overlooked such details, someone had been inside well before the murder occurred. Later, in Mrs. Winthrop's parlor, Miss Marple's knitting needle glided with gentle precision. Stitching her thoughts with precision, she considered a man who was the subject of disdain among many. A few had harbored grudges for years, casting shadows in a house where no one should have lingered. 2 figures emerged, one seen by her and the other by the maid, both slipping into Greystone Lodge under the veil of night. It was a web of loose ends, yet Miss Marple could already perceive the underlying shape of a greater truth. The patterns of human behavior were consistent. Their flaws were seldom original. Greed, resentment, guilt, these were familiar threads interwoven into the fabric of every village she had encountered. Ever known, she adjusted her ball of yarn, never looking up from her work. Before long, she thought the whole pattern would come clear. The rain had returned by evening, drawing a soft veil across the village once more. Miss Marple settled in her usual chair, glancing instinctively toward Greystone Lodge. Old habits, after all, are hard to break. And there it was again, a figure at the window. But this time, the gloom and rain did not conceal the truth. It was not the broad-shouldered silhouette of a man, but the slender outline of a woman, the face briefly illuminated by a flash of distant lightning. She was pale, framed by dark hair damp with rain. She stood utterly still, as though caught between 2 decisions, whether to enter or to run. Miss Marple's fingers paused in their knitting, but only for a moment. A woman, not a man, and that Miss Marple knew, changed everything. Miss Marple watched intently, the quiet pulse of her curiosity quickening. The woman stood with a posture that spoke not of guilt but of hesitation. She wasn't hiding, at least not from discovery. There was something vulnerable in the way her hands clutched at the collar of her coat, as if the cold mattered less than the weight of the decision pressing upon her. Then, without warning, the woman turned, stepping back into the shadows beyond the glass. By the time Miss Mel reached the window, the figure had vanished, swallowed up by the rain and the dark. Yet Miss Mel was not disappointed. She had seen enough to know this was no chance intruder. The woman had not come to steal or hide. She had come for a reason. The next morning, the village. The police were eagerly patting themselves on the back for cracking the case of the mysterious nighttime intruder, a poacher, they claimed, a familiar local character with a penchant for traps and a habit of straying onto private property. He had been spotted lurking near Greystone Lodge just before the storm hit. Mrs. Winthrop, for her part, was thrilled to have such an uncomplicated answer. Poachers are always sneaking around, she proclaimed at breakfast, likely with designs on the pheasants. Miss Merrill simply smiled, contemplating that the police had a tendency to jump to conclusions. There was a certain affection for those suspects who were easily decipherable, yet Miss Merrill had encountered the woman herself, neither a poacher nor a mere opportunistic trespasser. This situation was far more intimate, and Miss Merrill understood that intimacy often carried greater peril. Later that day, as she sipped a second pot of tea, Mrs. Winthrop's memory began to awaken. She recalled, albeit vaguely, a woman once associated with the Braithwaite family. It had been a dreadful scandal, as such matters invariably were, involving her daughter who had departed under troubling circumstances. Though Mrs. Winthrop couldn't quite recall the reason, she added with a satisfied air, "I expect that's who you saw. For some wicked reason, no doubt." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. Villagers, she knew, were skilled at misremembering, reshaping old scandals to fit new gossip. However, the timing was intriguing, as was Mrs. Winthrop's sudden eagerness to fill in gaps that no one had asked her to address. Miss Marple said nothing more, content to let the silence speak for itself. Later that evening, as the house settled in the stillness of night, Miss Marple contemplated the window across the lane. Windows, after all, do not deceive. They merely mirror what lies before them. It is the perception of those who gaze that skews reality. Whoever the woman was, Miss Marple was starting to form her theories. She had arrived at Greystone Lodge with intent. This was not a mere burglary, nor a random trespass, and certainly not the clumsy act of a village poacher. The window had disclosed enough. The remainder, Miss Marple mused, was simply a matter of time, as her knitting needles clicked softly in the quiet. Moved in their gentle rhythm, Miss Merrill allowed herself a rare moment of certainty. The woman at the window knew the truth about what had happened to Colonel Braithwaite. Whether she had seen it, caused it, or come to prevent it, only time would tell. But she knew, and that knowledge, Miss Merrill understood, made her either a witness or a target. Miss Merrill believed firmly in the value of polite intrusions, and so, armed with a modest bouquet of garden flowers, she paid a visit to Greystone Lodge, her demeanor fresh and warm, her manner disarmingly kind. Flowers, after all, could excuse a great deal, especially in villages where gestures held more weight than reasons. No one, not even a house emptied by tragedy, could refuse flowers. The officer stationed at the door seemed all too happy to let her in, assuming, as people often did, that Miss Marple's frailty rendered her harmless. She moved slowly through the familiar rooms, her gaze drifting lightly from shelf to sill. To anyone watching, she appeared merely as a neighbor paying her respects, but Miss Marple's attention was sharper. More than her smile, she sought answers rather than comfort. It was the photograph that drew her attention, not showcased with pride, but rather nudged to the side of the mantelpiece, its frame coated in dust. Colonel Braithwaite stood rigidly at the center, yet it was the woman beside him who captivated Miss Marple's gaze, a young woman smiling just a touch too brightly, her eyes reflecting that specific guardedness that arises when happiness has begun to fade. The face was recognizable, though time and scandal had taken their toll. Dimmed, the memory of the village lingered, yet Mel's recollection, honed by years of silent observation, functioned like a meticulously maintained needle, poised to weave together scattered fragments. There was an undeniable quality to the way her shoulders were set, the subtle tilt of her head that stirred something within Miss Marple's thoughts. She felt she had encountered this woman before, or perhaps someone who longed to be mistaken for her. Back at Mrs. Winthrop's, the photograph lay nestled between the teapot and the sugar bowl, its edges curling slightly with age. Oh my," Mrs. Winthrop exclaimed, peering at it through her. "Ah, spectacles. Why, that's Margaret, isn't it? The Colonel's daughter. I haven't thought about her in years." She stirred her tea, memories loosening alongside the leaves. Margaret Braithwaite, the girl who left in disgrace. There had been a scandal, naturally. These things always began with whispers and ended with silence. Margaret had vanished after some incident. No one could quite recall in detail, only that it involved a man unsuitable in every possible way. Miss Marple said nothing. Mrs. Winthrop's memory had always been selectively clear, bright when it. Others were conveniently vague when it came to matters too close to home. Mrs. Winthrop's voice took on a softer tone, as if the echoes of scandal could still resonate through the walls, even after all these years. Whispers of betrayal had circulated, accusations of intercepted letters, promises shattered, and a father's quiet fury that lingered until his daughter vanished. Some claimed she had rushed into marriage, while others suggested she had left for foreign shores under an alias. Yet, regardless of the reality, the enigma surrounding Margaret Braithwaite remained. Had vanished from Little Larchwood until now. As Miss Marple tucked the photograph back into her handbag, one question lingered in her mind, quiet yet persistent. Was the woman at the window truly Margaret Braithwaite, returned to reconcile with her father, or was someone, somewhere, manipulating the memory of Margaret to conceal something far more perilous, something still unraveling behind the shadowy windows of Greystone Lodge? Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her lap, the rhythm steady as her thoughts wove together loose threads of a stranger. In the village of Larchwood, where the curtains were drawn not just for privacy, but to shield hidden truths, a tale of intrigue unfolded. Miss Merrill, moving silently through her daily rounds, understood this unspoken reality better than anyone. At the baker's, her casual inquiry about scones seamlessly transitioned into memories of the Colonel's odd behaviors. A mention of postage rates sparked whispers of unpaid bills and a once fiery argument over a lost parcel. Meanwhile, at the greengrocer's, she listened intently, as if the very air was thick with secrets waiting to be uncovered. The likelihood that the Colonel's temper remained unyielding with age, and that his list of adversaries had not diminished, was evident. Each conversation bore an undercurrent, a meticulous transformation of reality into rumor. In the silence between the spoken words and the omissions, Miss Merrill discerned the truth she sought. The Colonel's demise was not a mere twist of fate. It was a knot formed long ago, gradually constricting over time, with someone, somewhere, intent on preventing its unraveling. It was the Colonel's former housekeeper, Mrs. Edgecombe, who provided the next thread in this intricate tapestry. With a sense of hesitation and after considerable coaxing, years prior, she revealed that there had been a romance, the kind that rarely concludes favorably in small towns. The Colonel's daughter, Margaret, had become deeply infatuated with a local man, someone deemed unworthy of her status, yet he comprehended her in ways her own family never could. The relationship ended in disaster, with hushed allegations spreading from one home to another. It transformed into a narrative warped into a warning, with Margaret discreetly taken away, the man left in the shadows, and the village left to ponder the consequences. Affection, much like whispered secrets, was a perilous thing to rely upon. Miss Merrill observed without casting judgment, yet her fingers, neatly folded in her lap, tightened ever so slightly. What captivated Miss Merrill most was not the love story itself, but the aftermath it had wrought. It was not merely Margaret's heart that lay shattered. The man she adored, the family she had embarrassed, and even the neighbors who had chosen sides each bore a lingering resentment, akin to a splinter lodged too deeply to extract. The Colonel had forged adversaries in ways only fathers can, and the village had remained silent, harboring its own unspoken grievances. Grudges had been nurtured into traditions, and suspicions were handed down like cherished family recipes. It was Miss Marple who believed this was precisely the kind of wound that could fester into something deadly, given the right circumstances. and it appeared that opportunity had indeed arrived the night the colonel met his end. As Miss Marple examined each account, she detected something unusual, a pattern of inconsistencies subtle enough to evade most listeners, yet glaringly apparent to someone familiar with the ways of gossip. Details morphed depending on the storyteller, and timelines twisted and elongated to fit their narratives. Fit the teller's preferred version, and now and then, Miss Marple detected something else. A deliberate nudge, a rumor gently steered in a particular direction, designed to mislead the listener rather than inform. This was no ordinary village chatter. This was a hand guiding the gossip, ensuring that the trail led away from certain names and toward a convenient scapegoat. Miss Marple's smile never faltered, but behind it, her mind sharpened like a needlepoint. The whisper Miss Marple knew belonged to someone with a great deal to lose. Someone who grasped the essence of the village, its rhythms, its vulnerabilities, and its yearning for a narrative simple enough to accept. This was not a haphazard act of deceit. It was a skillfully crafted performance meant to divert suspicion where it would cause the least damage, steering it away from the real perpetrator entirely. Yet, Miss Marple had experienced enough village productions to recognize when the script had been altered. Someone had orchestrated the scene well before the murder, ensuring that every hint led to the incorrect actor. Mel's fingers grazed the ball of yarn resting in her lap. With a single tug on the right thread, the entire curtain would fall. That evening, as Mrs. Winthrop read aloud from the newspaper and the fire settled into soft embers, Miss Mar's needles danced with gentle precision. It was no longer merely a murderer she pursued. It was the hand that had altered the narrative. The whisperer, who thought they understood the village's response, had overlooked one crucial detail. Mel had been listening far longer, and her needles moved with purpose. Her mind was poised to uncover the truth, one quiet stitch at a time. Miss Marple had always held the belief that the past tended to leave its marks on the present. Thus, on a tranquil afternoon, with the rain gently tapping at the window, she began to piece together the events of the murder night. The storm had erupted just before 9, a true village tempest, rattling window panes and sending water cascading down cobbled lanes. Greystone Lodge had remained silent and dark until, for a brief moment, a single lamp flickered to life. It was from the upstairs window that Miss Marple, while adjusting her knitting, caught sight of a figure. At first, it appeared tall, but as her gaze sharpened, the reality became clearer. A woman stood alone in the dark, gazing outward rather than inward. This figure did not rush or shrink away as one might anticipate from someone caught in a moment of surprise. Instead, there was a stillness that suggested waiting or watching. The lights flickered once more, and a door closed somewhere down the lane. By morning, Colonel Braithwaite was dead. Miss Marple's knitting lay quietly on her lap as she revisited the sequence once again. There was no urgency in the figure's posture, for it was not the stance of a murderer. People often misinterpreted what they observed, particularly when they anticipated guilt. That night, as the storm lashed at Little Larchwood, it was simple to conclude that the figure at the window was escaping a crime, wiping blood from trembling hands or straining to hear approaching footsteps. Yet, that was far from the reality. The figure had lingered there for too long, too calmly, too still. No, the woman at the window had not committed the murder. She had witnessed it. The true culprit, Miss Marple suspected, had already vanished by then, leaving nothing behind but silence and a house filled with secrets. The village police, of course, preferred neat answers to troubling questions. So, when a well-known poacher was caught with the colonel's missing brooch in his possession, the case seemed all but solved. A burglary gone wrong, they said, an unfortunate accident. The poacher, with his grimy hands and guilty expression, painted a rather unpleasant picture of the suspect. Mrs. Winthrop, delivering the news over tea, declared her to be exactly the sort of person capable of such a deed. Miss Marple remained silent, yet her experience with village justice had taught her to recognize when a suspect was more likely to be placed than discovered. A poacher might pilfer silver candlesticks or a bottle of brandy, but brooches? How very convenient, she mused, that the brooch in question was the very piece most easily identified by the colonel's housekeeper. Too convenient, indeed, she thought. Her stage solution was far too convenient, providing comfort to both villagers and police. It allowed everyone to tidy up their narratives and return to their knitting and newspapers. However, Miss Marple had never been one for neat endings. Life, as she often remarked, seldom adhered to convenience. The poacher, despite his mischief, had clearly been framed. Someone with an intimate understanding of Greystone Lodge, the Colonel's belongings, and the intricacies of village gossip had strategically placed the brooch to inflict maximum damage, a deft hand at work. Yet, lacking the finesse to deceive Miss Marple, the genuine perpetrator was someone who grasped the intricacies of village dynamics. This individual understood that once the community fixated on a recognizable antagonist, they would cease their search for alternative suspects. This person would need to be sufficiently acquainted with the Colonel to uncover his secrets, yet ordinary enough to evade scrutiny, perhaps a servant, a neighbor, or even a friend. Miss Marple's fingers danced over her knitting needles, as behind the veil of rumors and fabricated proof, the true orchestrator remained hidden. The invisible hand continued its subtle dance, attempting to craft a narrative that aligned with the hopes of all. Yet, Miss Marple perceived these tales as akin to intricate knitting patterns. Once a dropped stitch is noticed, the entire creation begins to unravel. As dusk enveloped the quaint larchwood, Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked in a steady rhythm, the yarn gliding effortlessly through her fingers. The pattern was nearing completion, just a handful of stitches remaining, a few final threads to secure. While she didn't possess all the answers, she had gathered enough insight to discern the unfolding mystery. With hands concealed behind the curtain, she understood that the murder was not a singular act, but rather two intertwined crimes. The act of killing itself and the calculated framing of an innocent man. The final thread, she believed, would unravel soon enough, revealing a pattern that the entire village would recognize. There was always an unsettling convenience surrounding sudden returns. Miss Marple had witnessed this before, relatives materializing just when inheritances were discussed, old friends resurfacing as buried secrets threatened to emerge. And so, as the pieces began to align, she remained vigilant. Mrs. Winthrop's nephew returned to Little Larchwood, all charming smiles and worldly stories. Miss Marple took note. He was perfectly pleasant, of course helpful with luggage, attentive to his aunt, effortlessly blending into village life as though he had never left. Yet beneath the polite charm, Miss Marple sensed an unease carefully masked. His smile lingered a fraction too long, his stories overly rehearsed, and there was a certain hesitation when conversation drifted toward Greystone Lodge. To Miss Marple, his timing was the real clue: years abroad, missing from every village gathering, and now, just as the Colonel had passed, and the house was once again at the heart of a scandal, he returned, like a thread weaving itself back into the fabric. With each hour that passed, Miss Marple became increasingly convinced that his return was not solely for his aunt's company. With gentle persistence, she began to tease out the edges of the truth, unraveling the nephew's meticulously crafted narrative of his life abroad. It appeared that his absence had been less about adventure and more about evasion. The aftermath of a botched business arrangement, one that entangled Colonel Braithwaite, was nothing short of tumultuous. The Colonel had placed his trust and his funds into a venture that boasted great potential but ultimately fell flat, leaving him not just financially wounded but seething with anger at the deception he had endured. Correspondence flew back and forth, sharp and unyielding, as the Colonel issued threats to unveil his partner's treachery if repayment was not promptly forthcoming. Miss Marple observed, her demeanor calm, as she noted the impact on the Colonel. For him, it was more than just a setback, it was a profound betrayal, particularly for someone astute. In a state of desperation, one might find a motive: a failed business, a man with everything at stake, and a benefactor capable of destruction with just a word. The pattern, Miss Marple mused, seemed to be emerging. Yet, she understood that money was seldom the sole factor in the village's murders. Emotions were always intertwined, and when hearts were wounded or shattered, their impact lingered long after financial disputes were resolved. Beneath the surface of the monetary conflict lay something more profound, a link to the Colonel's daughter, Margaret, long before the scandal unfolded. Margaret had been secretly entangled with none other than Mrs. Winthrop's nephew. It was a love affair shrouded in whispers, the kind that leaves traces no matter how meticulously concealed. Miss Marple could almost perceive the bitterness of their separation, the resentment towards the colonel, and the quiet understanding that Margaret's disgrace had cost them both their futures. Now, years later, the nephew had returned, not merely for revenge or money, but because old wounds refuse to heal when truth is allowed to fester beneath the surface. Silence the stranger at the window. The specter that had haunted Miss Marple's tranquil evenings was not a ghost at all. It was Margaret herself, returned not as a vengeful daughter, but as a desperate one. She had come not to punish her father, but to warn him. The man she once loved, the man she had been compelled to leave behind, had returned to the village with something far darker than heartbreak in his heart. She realized, perhaps too late, that her father's life was in peril not due to some long-forgotten scandal, but because some debts can only be paid in blood. But Margaret had witnessed far too much on that stormy night, concealed by rain and shadow. She arrived just in time to see it all unravel, a fleeting glimpse of a figure escaping Greystone Lodge, a face she never anticipated. It wasn't her former lover who dashed away, nor a faceless burglar or a vengeful poacher. It was a trusted member of the village, someone adept at redirecting suspicion and fading into the background like lace curtains drawn at dusk. Margaret, hidden at the window, had become the observer that went unnoticed, the one whom Miss Marple believed rendered her exceptionally perilous to the true culprit. Miss Mar's hands glided methodically over her knitting, the pale wool slipping effortlessly through her fingers. She was close to completing the sleeve, and the design itself had been straightforward, a manifestation of rural conflict stemming from deep-seated resentments and urgent need. Yet, the concealment had been a masterpiece of subtle ingenuity, a display crafted for an audience that never questioned the narrative presented to them. There was a singular imperfection, a misaligned stitch that only someone with keen perception, like Miss Marple, would detect. The true culprit was not lurking in the darkness. They had been present, smiling and serving tea, secure in the belief that no one would scrutinize hands so well known. Now, Miss Marple felt it was the moment to unveil the truth to the village. Mrs. Winthrop's sitting room had hosted countless gatherings over the years, afternoon teas, sewing circles, and the rare meeting of the flower committee, but on this occasion, it was destined for something far more significant. On this particular afternoon, a unique hush enveloped the gathering. The usual hum of polite conversation had faded into an expectant silence as the villagers arranged themselves in a circle of well-worn chairs, their curiosity anchored by Miss Marple's presence. She sat, as always, with her knitting in her lap, embodying mildness. Yet, the careful way her fingers rested on the needles hinted that something significant was on the horizon. There were no raised voices, no dramatic announcements. Just a soft clearing of her throat and the slightest hint of a smile, as if she were about to share a particularly intriguing recipe. But what followed was far from culinary. It was the slow unveiling of a crime concealed in plain sight. It began, Miss Marple said gently, with a small theft, one so subtle that it went unnoticed until it became too significant to overlook. Years ago, Mrs. Winthrop had been entrusted with certain household accounts, a role of quiet authority that eventually led to temptation. A pound here, a minor adjustment there, with no one the wiser. One who scrutinizes too intently might find that Colonel Braith, despite his flaws, was a man of meticulous record-keeping. When he unexpectedly chose to amend his will, certain inconsistencies began to loom large. Mrs. Winthrop, confronted with the looming threat of disgrace and ruin, made a decision not born of hatred, but rather from a place of sheer, desperate fear. Miss Mel's voice remained steady, yet the truth descended upon the room like a chilling fog, enveloping every courteous belief the villagers had previously held about Mrs. Winthrop. The act of murder itself had been, almost as an afterthought. Miss Marple recounted the tragic outcome of a mind stretched beyond its limits. On the night of the storm, Mrs. Winthrop had crossed the lane, key already in hand, her feet tracing a path she had walked countless times in happier days. She was familiar with the house, its locks and latches, and knew precisely where the colonel would be, as regular in his habits as the village clock. A single blow, swift and intentional, no struggle, no warning, struck a man who trusted her enough to turn his back, followed by the hasty staging of a window left ajar. A jar of brooch planted for the police to find a story prepared for the village to swallow. How it had almost worked. Almost. There had been one thing Mrs. Winthrop had not expected. Margaret Braithwaite's return, the daughter burdened by years of silence, had come back to make peace, to reconcile with her father before it was too late. But by the time she arrived, it was already far too late. She had stood at the window, heart trembling with uncertainty, unaware that the father she feared and loved in equal measure lay lifeless just beyond the door. Miss Marple's voice softened. It was not vengeance that brought Margaret home. It was hope. And hope, as Miss Marple knew all too well, was often the cruelest of villagers. She said quietly, "Secrets are rarely buried. They are simply folded away like linens in a drawer, waiting for the wrong hand or the right one to pull them out again." Lace curtains, Miss Marple had always thought, were particularly fitting. They seemed so delicate, so innocent, yet through them one could watch without being seen. And behind them, even the gentlest hands could conceal a multitude of transgressions. Mrs. Winthrop's hands, now trembling in her lap, had once poured tea and trimmed roses. They had also, just once, grasped a heavy candlestick with lethal intent. And now, at last, the curtains were drawn back, revealing the truth to the village. In places like Little Larchwood, life has a peculiar way of folding itself back into order, regardless of how violently it has been disturbed. The gossip that once rippled through tea shops and along garden gates has softened into mere memory. The murder transformed into a cautionary tale recounted in hushed tones. With whispers and knowing glances, Colonel Braithwaite transformed into a mere name rather than a man. His virtues were polished and exaggerated until they aligned seamlessly with the village's favored narrative. Mrs. Winthrop's absence from social gatherings was acknowledged but seldom addressed openly. Her guilt lingered like a stain that polite society chose to overlook, as if silence could somehow cleanse it. Thus, the village continued on. Scones were served, letters dispatched, gardens tended, life carried on. Yet, beneath the surface, Miss Merrill sensed a subtle shift in the village, akin to the earth settling into place. After a storm, some wounds close. She thought others simply sink beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered again. Miss Marple's bag was neatly packed, her knitting tucked away beside a sprig of lavender from Mrs. Winthrop's garden. The farewell was polite, but it lacked the warmth of their first meeting. Mrs. Winthrop, once so bustling and sure, seemed somehow diminished, her voice softer, her hands a touch unsteady as she poured the tea. There were no direct words about what had passed between them, only a shared understanding. Polite villages tend to overlook discomfort, even when it has seeped into their very foundations. "It's truly unfortunate about poor Margaret," Mrs. Winthrop remarked softly, reflecting on the years that slipped away. "Families can be so intricate," Miss Merrill concurred, her tone tender, yet her thoughts drifting just a bit. Not towards Margaret, but to the delicate boundary between compassion and harshness, which frequently becomes indistinct in communities where every secret is shared. Before departing, Miss Merrill permitted herself one final look at the window across the lane, the window where it all began as the rain subsided, leaving the glass to mirror only the sky and the garden. Yet, Miss Merrill could still envision the figure in her mind, the fleeting silhouette, the tension in its posture, the lingering sense of something unresolved. Her window, after all, is a curious entity. It provides a view in both directions, observing as much as it is observed. This particular window had witnessed a daughter's return, a murderer's retreat, and a villager's attempt to avert their gaze. Miss Merrill understood that it was not the first window to harbor a secret, nor would it be the last, with lace curtains framing its enigmatic view. Always captivated by Miss Marple, they were delicate, even pretty, yet served a purpose. They filtered truth, softening the edges of what lay behind them, offering just enough to satisfy curiosity without ever fully revealing the whole. They stood as a perfect symbol for village life itself, presenting charm and civility to the outside world while concealing jealousies, grudges, and whispered betrayals within. Behind every curtain, Miss Marple believed, lay a story. Some were harmless, a harmless flirtation, a borrowed book never returned, while others, like this one, were darker, twisted into knots by years of resentment and fear. She reflected the same pattern everywhere she went. No matter how quaint the village or how polished the silver, the curtains always hid something, and it was always the same truth. Human nature does not change, only the curtains do. As the train carried Miss Marr away from Little Larchwood, the fields and hedgerows slipping past the window, she found herself smiling softly. Murder, she had long since learned, was rarely about madness or evil. It was about ordinary things: fear, greed, love. Revenge weaves through the fabric of every village, every town, every life. People often consider themselves intricate, yet Miss Marple found them quite predictable. The costumes may shift: a lace curtain here, a silver candlestick there, but beneath it all, the same instincts endure. As the village slipped away, Miss Marr reached into her bag, pulled out her knitting, and allowed her fingers to return to their well-known rhythm. The mystery had been unraveled, justice had been achieved, but the complexities of human nature remained dark and tangled. Endlessly captivating, there would always be more intricacies to explore, and Miss Marple, for her part, would always be prepared. Absolutely, here's your highly engaging, audience-focused, well-crafted conclusion tailored for your Miss Marple narrative. As the train whisked Miss Marple away from Little Larchwood, the village returned to its genteel rhythms. Scones were served, roses were pruned, and life resumed, at least on the surface. Yet, beneath the tranquility, the tale of Greystone Lodge would endure, recounted in hushed tones over tea. Biscuits for years to come. And isn't that the curious thing about villages? Behind their lace curtains and clipped hedges lie secrets far darker than the world imagines. It's never the obvious villain or the suspicious outsider. It's the trusted hands that pour the tea, the neighbor who remembers birthdays, the friend who always seems so very helpful. In the end, it's human nature itself that holds the sharpest edges. Miss Marr's gift, you see, isn't just solving puzzles. It's understanding people, their pride, their fear, their subtle betrayals linger in the air, and despite the charm of the village, those complex emotions are universal. This leads us to a thought-provoking question. If you were Miss Marple gazing out that window, would you have discerned the truth, or would you have accepted the narrative crafted by others? I'm eager to hear your reflections. What actions would you take upon seeing that stranger at the window? What do you believe drives a person to commit murder? Desperation, greed, or perhaps something even deeper? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'm eager to hear your perspectives. If you found joy in piecing together this enigma with us, be sure to subscribe for more intriguing twists, sharp-witted sleuths, and narratives that challenge your perceptions of those around you. Don't forget to share this tale with your fellow enthusiasts. Solving these conundrums is always more enjoyable in good company. Thank you for being part of this journey, and until our next adventure, remember that in the stillest corners, the most profound secrets are often lurking, waiting to be discovered.